Hello, I am Peter Okocha. Welcome to Focus on Africa. Our top stories. A rare public address. Cameroon's President Paul Biya calls for a national dialogue to end the conflict between separatist groups and security forces.
On the other hand, those who persist in committing criminal acts and violating the laws of the Republic will face our defense and security forces.
A somber reception. The body of Zimbabwe's former President Robert Mugabe arrives in Harare ahead of the burial on Sunday. Also on the program, documenting trauma in virtual reality. We speak to the filmmaker whose documentary on the kidnapped Nigerian schoolgirls in Chibok has just won a major prize. And in sports, FIFA President Gianni Infantino attends his first CAF and FIFA Reform Task Force in Egypt. Thanks for joining us here on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Cameroon's President Paul Biya has called for a national dialogue at the end of the month to address an ongoing conflict between separatist groups and government forces. An estimated 2,000 people have died since fighting began in late 2016 in the country's English-speaking regions. Thousands more have been displaced. The current crisis started in 2016 when lawyers and teachers went on strike over the use of French in courts and schools. In October 2017, activists declared autonomy over the two English-speaking regions, a move which was rejected by Cameroon's President Paul Biya. Some members of the separatist movement took up arms in 2017, and the crisis has forced more than 500,000 people from their homes. Well, in a rare address to the country on Tuesday night, President Biya offered negotiations as a route to peace.
I have decided to convene at the end of this month a major national dialogue that will enable us, within the limits of our constitution, to examine ways and means of meeting the deep aspirations of the peoples of the Northwest and Southwest, but also of all the other components of our nation. It is true that in the context of a dialogue, a peace process or national reconciliation, the possibility of a pardon may be considered under certain conditions. Those who voluntarily lay down their weapons and make themselves available to DDR centers have nothing to fear. On the other hand, those who persist in committing criminal acts and violating the laws of the Republic will face our defense and security forces and will suffer the full rigor of the same laws. I appeal to the countries that host these extremists. If they really care about the situation of the people of the Northwest and Southwest, let them take action against these criminals.
President Paul Biya there. So what do Cameroonians make of this proposal for negotiations? We spoke to some of them on the streets of the capital, Yaoundé.
I think the dialogue should be between the government and advocates for separation, those abroad, because are the ones sponsoring the crisis. So it should be between the government and them.
Judging from how he calls dialogue shows that he wants a permanent solution for the country.
Yeah, actually he talked of dialogue because that's the most important thing that we want and what we have been waiting for. But if he's talking of dialogue and the people he has to dialogue with are in the prison, then I don't know how the dialogue is going to go about. So if he's talking about dialogue, he has to set the people free so we can sit on the table of dialogue.
Let's now speak to Chris Anu. He's Communications Secretary for the Ambazonia Interim Government. That's the separatist movement. So, Chris, President Paul Biya has offered negotiations. Is your group willing to take him up on that?
Well, Peter, thank you for having me here. First, let me tell you, the offer that Mr. Biya has made is a non-starter. you do not imprison the custodians of this struggle with life sentences and then call for dialogue. Number two, the kind of dialogue that Mr. Biya has announced is not the kind of dialogue or negotiation that the international community has endorsed. The only form of dialogue that we will appreciate and collaborate with is the Swiss initiative that we believe Mr. Biya is trying to run away from.
But Chris, if I may just jump in, I mean, even the United Nations has said this is an opportunity for the separatist groups like yours to come and sit on the table and lay their grievances before the government and seek some kind of settlement. That is what the people in Cameroon want.
Peter, the United Nations also said they endorsed the Swiss initiative. The EU, the United States, Canada, and so many other countries endorse that Swiss initiative. And let me tell you what the difference is between Biya's dialogue and the Swiss initiative that he is avoiding. The Swiss initiative says, go sit on the table and look at this conflict from the perspective of the root causes. But in Yaoundé, in Cameroon, Mr. Biya wants to appoint his own cronies in his own ruling party. He is solely going to be the person to decide who sits on that dialogue table.
I think President Biya might have an argument to counter that, saying that the person in charge of these talks is the Prime Minister, who is actually from one of these regions that you're talking about. But let's talk about groups like yours, the Ambazonia Interim Government. The problem is that you are not even speaking with one voice. We speak to one group today and they say, well, that group does not represent us. We are part of a different group.
No, absolutely. You got it all wrong, sir. If you have been following up the Swiss initiative, all of us, every single group in Ambazonia and the diaspora is engaged, fully engaged in the Swiss initiative. By talking about the Prime Minister of Cameroon, whom Biya has said is going to be at the helm of this dialogue, that doesn't change anything. The Prime Minister is Biya's appointee. Remember, sir, there are only two partners in this conflict: the Southern Cameroonians, Ambazonians, and French Cameroon. But Biya is calling this a national dialogue that has to include the Nordis, the Bamilikis, the Iwondos, and the Betis. You can name the rest. But we know there are only two parties: Southern Cameroonians and French Cameroon.
Okay, Chris, we'll have to leave it there. Chris Anu from the Ambazonia Interim Government. That's the separatist group in northwest and southwest Cameroon. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Now, the body of the former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe has arrived in the capital, Harare, and been received by a guard of honor. Mr. Mugabe died in hospital in Singapore on Friday at the age of 95. He rose to power after Zimbabwe's independence from Britain and governed until he was ousted by the military in 2017. Mr. Mugabe will be buried on Sunday. Well, the BBC's Shingai Nyoka has been following developments in Harare and joins us now. Shingai, the body is finally home. What's the mood tonight?
Well, Peter, I'll tell you that at the airport earlier on today, it was almost as if Robert Mugabe never left as president. Hundreds of supporters had gathered. They were singing, dancing, chanting in praise of Robert Mugabe. But when the plane touched down, there was a somber mood that just fell over the crowd. What we saw after he left the airport to go to the military barracks and head into town was Zimbabweans lining the street as his hearse passed by. This is the report that we bring to you. The liberator of Zimbabwe, who became an oppressor, is back on home soil. The country is divided over Robert Mugabe's legacy, the independence hero whose 37-year rule was marked first by prosperity and later economic ruin. A specially chartered flight carrying his body arrived in Harare from Singapore. He'd been receiving hospital treatment there when he died last week, aged 95. Stricken by grief, Robert Mugabe's widow Grace, along with other family members, made the journey. There was great ceremony. His coffin was carried by a guard of honor. Also paying homage was President Emmerson Mnangagwa. He'd been Mugabe's right-hand man, but then he engineered his downfall using the army to end his rule. Today he praised the memory of the leader he deposed.
The light which led us to independence is no more, but his works, his ideology will continue to guide this nation.
In the minds of many Zimbabweans, Robert Mugabe died years ago when he was deposed. But his arrival home in preparation for his burial puts finality to the life of a figure who towered Zimbabwean politics for over 40 years. The crowds were a reminder of his past popularity. They still revered, despite the excesses of his later years in office. His body will lie at his mansion overnight. A state funeral service attended by heads of state will be held on Saturday. Whether he'll be buried privately, as some in his family desire, or at the national shrine is still being negotiated, as state and family haggle for the body of the man who liberated Zimbabwe. Shingai Nyoka, BBC News, Harare. Well, the question still remains, and hopefully there will be an answer to that now that Grace Mugabe has arrived back home with the family. We've been told that the announcement will be made in the next coming days about where exactly he's going to be buried. But currently, Robert Mugabe's remains are at the Blue Roof, his mansion in northern Harare. And we understand that over 100 buses have been sent out to the province to bring Zimbabweans, ordinary Zimbabweans, into the city tomorrow and on Friday to pay their last respects. We've already seen that representatives from Southern Africa have already started coming in. His family have said that they wanted a funeral that befits his stature, and he might actually receive that.
Okay, Shingai Nyoka, live there from Harare. Thank you very much. Let's take a quick look now at other stories making the headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. A group of Nigerian nationals has left South Africa and are on their way back to Nigeria. It follows recent xenophobic attacks in Johannesburg. Nigeria announced it will repatriate about 600 of its nationals after the violence broke. 12 people were killed and hundreds more arrested during days of looting and rioting. Pope Francis has urged Britain to comply with the UN resolution to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. He was speaking at the end of his African tour. Britain evicted around 2,000 Chagosians between 1967 and 1973 to allow the United States to build a military base in Diego Garcia, the largest of the Chagos Islands. And Americans are marking the 18th anniversary of the September 11 attacks. Families and friends gathered at the World Trade Center in New York. Almost 3,000 people were killed after Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked planes and brought down the Twin Towers. South Sudan's President Salva Kiir and the former rebel leader Riek Machar have promised to form a transitional government by mid-November. Last year, the two rivals signed a peace agreement aimed at ending their country's civil war, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced up to 4 million more. Here's the BBC's Tommy Oladipo with more on the story.
President Salva Kiir and his rival Riek Machar have met every day this week. But before that, the last time the two men were face to face was in April in the Vatican City. And that says a lot about two men who should be working together to bring about a transitional government. Even though they signed this deal back in September last year, the government says it's not been able to bring about this transitional government because it doesn't have the funds to integrate and disarm the different rebel groups. Now, Riek Machar, the rebel leader, has remained in exile in Sudan. He's only come to Juba for this meeting, and he says he doesn't have the guarantee that he will be safe if he moves back home. On the other hand, President Salva Kiir says in these talks they've had this week, they have been making progress, and he thinks that this peace agreement leading to a transitional government will go ahead. He feels that they will have this transitional government in place by the 12th of November, which is the deadline. Now, critics have looked at this deal that was signed last year, and they have doubted its credibility and said that it will probably go the way of its predecessors, which collapsed only after a few months. But these two men insist that they have the wherewithal and that this will be the final deal where Sudan will be able to move on from its years of conflict.
Tommy Oladipo there. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Peter Okwache. Still to come, Mimi with the sports. Former Manchester City captain Vincent Kompany won't be taking part in his star-filled testimonial today. Welcome back. Next now to a film about the 276 female students kidnapped from a school in Chibok in northeast Nigeria over 5 years ago. Filmmaker Joel Kachi Benson met some of their parents in the aftermath of the kidnapping to hear their story and made a documentary entitled Daughters of Chibok. It premiered at the Venice International Film Festival last weekend and won an award. Let's take a look at the doc.
When they told me that my daughter, Rifkatu, was among the girls that were kidnapped from the school, I could not believe it. What did I do? Who did I offend? Many women lost their daughters that night.
Well, I'm glad to say Joel joins us now from our Lagos studio. First of all, congratulations, Joel. Did you really expect to win the Best VR Story Award?
No. That came to me as a very, very pleasant surprise. I mean, first of all, I was shocked. I didn't expect it. I just went to Venice to have a good time, meet people, understand better, the VR space and what other people are doing. So when I was told the film would get an award, it was a very surreal experience for me.
Okay, we'll talk about VR in a moment, but why did you decide to make this documentary on the Chibok girls?
I mean, I've always been curious about Chibok. When the story broke 5 years ago, there were so many versions to the story. It was sort of hard to separate fact from fiction. And so I made up my mind then that if I ever had the opportunity to go to Chibok, I would love to, understand better the story. So I was, making another documentary in the Northeast, and it took us through Chibok. And I had to stop and, met the women, met the men, met the people, asked questions. And obviously, from then on, I knew that I had to tell the story.
Now, I've watched bits of the documentary, and your main subject, Yana Galang, is quite a remarkable woman, isn't she?
Oh, yes, she is. She's a very, very strong character, very strong woman.
And you've shot this in VR. Tell us what that means and why you did that.
Well, we had the option of either making it in VR or just like a flat 2D documentary. But we chose VR because it was important to sort of take people to Chibok. Even in Nigeria, Chibok is so far away. You have to fly 2 hours and then drive for another 6 hours to get there. So it's really quite a very distant place. And that also sort of, I guess the distance adds to the whole mystery around Chibok. Very few people have ever been there. And so the question was, how do we make this experience as real as possible for the viewers? And it was just, let's do it in 360. Let's make a VR documentary.
And
give people
indeed,
that
it actually
experience.
brings out the story. Just finally, how has this documentary been received in Nigeria? It's been well received abroad, but what about back home in Nigeria?
Well, I mean, the people that have seen it have really commented that they love the story. Obviously, the empathy level has gone up. And so we have quite a few people saying, okay, so what can we do? We never knew it was this bad. How can we help? And that really was the reason why we made the film. You know, is really to use the film as a vehicle to draw attention to the plight of these women and do something for them. All right. We cannot, as regular people, bring back their daughters, right? But we can do something to make their lives just a little bit easier. And so I feel that the film,
Thank you very much for speaking to us here on Focus on Africa, the director of the Daughters of Chibok. Congratulations to you. You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. It's now time for some sports. And Mimi, take it away.
Thank you very much, Peter. The joint FIFA and CAF task force held their first meeting in Cairo on Tuesday and was attended by FIFA President Gianni Infantino. This comes after the administration of the Confederation of African Football was taken over by the FIFA Secretary General Fatma Samura, who was appointed as FIFA General Delegate for Africa, following allegations of corruption against CAF President Ahmad. He denies any wrongdoing. A 5-person team has been appointed to strengthen and speed up proposed reforms. Sarah Mawson from our BBC Cairo Bureau with more.
President of FIFA Gianni Infantino arrived in Cairo on Tuesday to jointly inaugurate the FIFA Reforms Task Force for African Football. We know that FIFA have formed an independent task force to help reform the scandal-ridden Confederation of African Football, and the task force members are Abdullah Diop from Mali, Hussam al-Shafi'i from Egypt, Janet Katissia from Kenya, Martin Nagoga from Rwanda, and from Ghana, Anini Bowa. Topics discussed in the meeting were transparency, the necessity of high standards of compliance, the effective organization of competitions, the development of African football, as well as the support of all members of the association. Infantino said in the meeting that the African football will be envied around the world if CAF FIFA partnership is implemented successfully.
And the lineup is finally complete for the Under-23 Africa Cup of Nations. 8 teams will be competing. Egypt are the host, and joining them will be South Africa, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, Nigeria, Zambia, Ghana, and Mali. Their tournament takes place from the 8th to the 22nd of November. The top 3 teams qualify to next year's Olympics in Tokyo. Moving on, later today, the testimonial match for former Manchester City captain Vincent Kompany, who is of Congolese descent, takes place at the Etihad Stadium. But sadly, the defender won't be able to take part due to a hamstring injury. But his lineup will include some African stars, former Ivory Coast international Kolo Toure. Another star from the continent will be Zimbabwe's Benjani. 33-year-old Kompany, who is now a player-manager at Belgian club Anderlecht, was meant to feature in the City Legends team against an all-star Premier League.
Unfortunately, no, I won't be starting tonight or playing. But it's typical of me, right? So I'm usually there for the end of the season, and I've got a slight hamstring injury, so I couldn't unfortunately risk it tonight. But still, plenty of awesome players to be watching today. And anyway, it's about a celebration.
What a great career he had with City. Back to you, Peter.
Mimi, are you scared of snakes?
Oh, very scared.
I'm petrified of them. So you might enjoy the story, actually. Well, for those of you who are frightened of snakes, you might want to look away. Dozens of people have been flocking to a village in western Tanzania to pay pilgrimage to a huge python. They believe it has mystical powers and have been feeding it chicken and rice. The government have now moved the snake to the national park, saying it's not safe for the residents or the snakes. Not for me at all. Don't forget, you can get in touch with me and some of the team on social media. I'm at Okwoche. But for now, that's it from me, Peter Okwoche, and the rest of the Focus on Africa team. Thanks for watching, and see you again very soon.